Welcome to The Link Online. And we're here live on Facebook at 14:15 hours GMT, 10:15 Eastern Time in Canada. And we're also heard on World Radio Paris and the shortwave service from Germany and Kauri 97.5 FM radio in Nigeria. And I have with me the full team today. We have, to my right, we have the lovely and talented Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
And then we have Matthew Leiser.
Hi, everybody.
Levon Savons.
Hello.
Myself, Mark Montgomery. And in the control room, we have Marc-André Deschamps, Benoit Durand, and the ever-popular, boy, he gets lots of mail. It's people just want to know more about this mysterious man called Pierre Dutil. We get emails. We get phone calls. Who is this man? What does he do? Well, he does everything. He knows how the place works. Everything else is a mystery to us. We go to Pierre. He answers our questions, fixes our email problems, fixes our internet problems. It's just, what can I say? But he's a mystery man, and he's hiding behind this very glass to my left. That aside, we have an interesting program, as we always do for you. Matthew, what do you have for us today?
I'm going to talk about a new art exhibition that looks at the former British colony of Newfoundland and its connections to the slave trade.
And Levon, we're going to start off with you and something serious, of course.
Yeah, I'll be talking to a Russian expert about his warnings about the Russian disinformation campaign targeting Canada's federal election.
And speaking of elections, Marie-Claude.
Yes, I'll show you how to get very well informed by just going through our website about the elections. We have all new icons and stuff like that.
And information about how it works and who's ahead and what they're talking about. So that's coming up a little bit later on. And I'll be talking about the future of daily print newspapers with a senior editor of a national news chain who says the future is not very bright unless multinational internet operations like Google and Facebook and others start paying for their fair share of content they take from those newspapers and start to pay taxes in the domestic country where they take those sources from. That's coming up on this edition of The Link Online. All right, we're going to start out. Of course, the big news is that here in Canada, the federal election has been called and is now starting to be in full swing. Canadians going to the polls in October 21st. Political parties, advocacy groups, and lobbyists of all sorts are now jockeying for position to try to capture the attention of the Canadian voters with their various messages. But sometimes those messages may not be from official sources or perhaps not quite what they're meant to be. Yes. Levon, you're looking into this. What's happening?
Well, for me, it all started with this paper that was published earlier this week at the University of Calgary in Alberta. The author of the study is Sergei Sukhankin. He's a Russian researcher who now teaches in Canada, and he specializes in strategic studies and in the Russian information warfare. And he says that basically Canadian and Russian interests now collide in many areas, in the Arctic, in Ukraine, in the Baltics. He says in particular, Canada's support for the pro-Western government in Ukraine, Canada's decision to deploy combat troops in Latvia, just across the border from Russia, has made Ottawa a target of a possible disinformation campaign in this upcoming election. And Sukhankin says this disinformation machine is based on the old Soviet model, but comes with some major improvements.
In many ways, Russia's current disinformation campaigns against Western countries, including Canada, of course, it derives its origins from the Soviet period. So what the Soviets did, it was based on a number of instruments, a number of tools that included disinformation or classic fake stories, release of the compromat, and a host of other measures. What is totally different today, what differs Russia's disinformation from the Soviet one, is that Russia has been able to get rid of this ideological surcharge, which has made Russian propaganda and disinformation much more flexible and appealing to various sides of respective societies where Russia tries to channel its disinformation. This, at the same time, makes Russia's disinformation much more dangerous and much more far-reaching phenomena than it used to be before 1991. Canada, of course, is seen by Moscow as one of the most Russophobic countries. This is quite explicitly visible in various reports, various papers that are issued by Russia's pro-Kremlin information outlets such as RT, Sputnik, that portray Canada as Russia's, I wouldn't say an arch enemy, but a country that it's been progressively anti-Russian and Russophobic since at least 2014, and the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis, when Canada, Ottawa, rendered full and unconventional support to Kiev, to Ukraine, and this infuriated the Russian side, and as I said, transformed Canada from just an adverse country into a country that forms the vanguard of anti-Russian forces in the West.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Sergei Sukhankin. He's a researcher and a senior fellow with the U.S. think tank, the Jamestown Foundation. He's currently teaching at the Concordia University of Edmonton. And we had a much longer discussion, so if this subject interests you, just go on the webpage and listen to the interview. It's quite interesting.
It is interesting how this whole thing about disinformation and fake news has cropped up in the last few years, especially, of course, since the U.S. General election. But for people to be able to determine what is and what isn't fake news, or what is or what isn't sort of a disinformation campaign, it's pretty darn hard.
Yeah, and interesting that you mentioned this, because yesterday actually there was an event, I think in Ottawa, where former head of the Canadian Domestic Intelligence Service, CSIS, and former National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau, James Fadden, actually spoke about this and talked how, you have all these foreign actors, coming with these messages, but really it's up to Canadians to use their brains and do some research. When you see a story that is divisive, just make sure that you got your sources right. That do a bit of digging before sharing it, because it might not necessarily be Russia or China. It could be another political party, but
or an individual with an
agenda.
Or
an individual with an agenda. So we now have the moral responsibility to check our sources. With the social media, every Canadian, every person who has an account on social media has basically become an editor-in-chief, and he gets to decide what gets to disseminate it. And so there is no foolproof mechanism. But if we stop sharing this stuff
without at least verifying
it, it's not going to be as effective as it has been.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting point, because this is mostly via social media, and people tweeting and retweeting and so on and so on.
He brought, because I asked him, I said, listen, so what are some of the examples of this Russian disinformation that you could cite, because we hear a lot about it. And the interesting thing he says is that you have to understand that disinformation campaign is targeted as much as the Russian audiences, trying to kind of inoculate them to Western narratives, as against the Western audiences, and in Canada in particular. One of the most egregious cases he cited is this famous case of a crucified boy. This was a story that run in July of 2014 at the height of fighting between these Ukrainian government forces and pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine. And this story that apparently Ukrainian government forces had crucified a 3-year-old boy on this Lenin Square in the city of Sloviansk. Now there was this story run on the number one television, the state-owned Russia number one TV channel. When some Russian independent journalists went to Sloviansk to try to find the family of this boy and stuff, very soon they realized that this story was completely made up. The TV channel that originally ran the story was eventually forced to say that it was inaccurate, but nobody heard that correction. So there are millions of Russians to this day who believe that these Ukrainian soldiers crucified a 3-year-old boy. And he says that's the danger, that even when the story gets corrected, not as many people pay attention to the correction, that record of misinformation remains.
Now, that's always been the case. You get a headline saying this happened, and then when it turns, or this person has been accused of this, and when that person has been shown to be not guilty at all, that goes in the back pages of a newspaper or far down a newscast, or not at all, and that accusation remains in the general consciousness. It's interesting about this crucifixion, because that reminds me of a very similar story back in World War I, where there was a massive outcry because the German soldiers were alleged to have crucified a Canadian soldier on the battlefield on a hand sort of built cross, which was never ever proven. There was no evidence that ever happened, but that myth, I guess, remained very popular for years. So this just shows you how important the media is, the regular media, the trustworthy media, as opposed to, say, social media. And that brings us to our next story. Well, Canadian media is suffering somewhat, especially perhaps the daily print newspapers. Across Canada, several smaller centres have seen their local newspapers close up or be replaced by larger regional or provincial papers that no longer cover local concerns. And even the larger corporations and operations have been cutting back the number of reporters they have on staff, and it's all due in no small part to the internet and the rise of international giants like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so on. Lucinda Choden is senior editor of the national news group Post Media and editor of the Gazette newspaper in Montreal, the largest English-language daily in the province of Quebec. And she says for the past 10 years or more, news operations have been concerned about two main issues.
One is the disappearance of our traditional advertising-supported revenue model. The second is the rise of international giants like Google and like Facebook, which repurpose our content without paying us for it and without in any way paying taxes that support the Canadian journalistic economy.
So what effect has the internet had generally on newspapers?
Well, many of us have found that we are reaching, paradoxically, more audiences than ever before. People unfettered by geography can get the contents that we produce every day in our newsroom. However, they aren't paying for it. They aren't paying in terms of a digital subscription to the degree that it would make it possible for us to keep employing the number of journalists that we have. And the advertisers are not paying for the ads to the degree that they would if we were selling them print ads. Both of those things have had a very dampening effect on our ability to retain the number of journalists we have.
What about the amalgamation of control of newspapers and media outlets?
There used to be a saying that freedom of the press belongs to those who can own a printing press. That is not the case any longer. There are all kinds of digital-only startups. However, the larger organizations are the people who have enough money to pay professional journalists to produce professional news content. So it's a bit of a catch-22. You can't get local news reliably from a blogger or a online-only website.
Now, you earlier mentioned about some of these giant multinational corporations like Google and Amazon and so on taking content. Are they paying you for it, or how do they get that content that they in turn get revenues from adverts on their sites?
Depending on the platform, Google does not pay us for news that is disseminated on Google, although they sell advertising around the content that we provide. We're not necessarily asking for Facebook to give us $5 per 100 stories or anything like that. We are suggesting that they must pay taxes. And I mean, all Canadian news organizations pay Canadian taxes and employ Canadian employees who also pay taxes. Google and Facebook do not.
Is this the same situation, as far as you know, pretty much around the developed world?
Certainly in North America and in Western Europe, it is a challenge. Those organizations that have scale, so in other words, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, who have a potentially large international audience for their content, are doing better than local news organizations. And I think that is really one of the things that is a great danger to democracy in all of the communities in those areas, which is if nobody is disseminating reliable information, how are citizens going to make choices about who they're going to vote for mayor, what they should do about recycling, all of those kinds of local issues. People's decisions need to be predicated on firm, reliable, credible information about that so that they can make up their own minds. And local news is the commodity that is the most endangered by all of this.
What kind of future is there for print newspapers, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure there is a long future for print newspapers. I do think that what we see from the numbers of people who are consuming our content digitally is that people are very hungry for news and information.
And there you have it. That was an edited version of my conversation with Lucinda Choden, who is a senior editor with the Post Media News Group, a national organization, and the editor for the Gazette newspaper here in Montreal. You used to work for the Gazette.
Yes, she's my former editor.
But you have seen in the news business, in that particular aspect of the news business, we've seen some of it here, but you've seen the cuts too, because I think they've had to cut about 30% of their reporting staff in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I remember how big the Gazette newsroom was when I started working there in 2000. And we were in a big building with our own printing presses. Then the Gazette moved to a location in downtown Montreal on St. Catherine Street. Printing presses moved to a different location. And now, because they don't need that much space anymore, they have moved to another location, again in downtown, but a smaller one. And you can see the newspaper getting thinner and thinner. And for me, I think, like for many Canadians, the big loss was when they cut the weekend edition. Because for me, it was a ritual, sitting down on Saturday with that thick copy of the Gazette and having a coffee on my terrace and just browsing through the newspaper and reading parts of the newspaper that I would usually not read at all. And I'm actually surprised why the newspaper industry hasn't been more vocal about these giants like Google and Facebook and others literally picking their content for free. Like we work in radio. If I play a piece of music today on my show, if we play it here, we have to pay royalties to the person who has produced this album, and it's not a lot, but it's a little that comes from every time we use music. I don't understand why the same system couldn't be used to and applied to these internet giants, especially now with all this artificial intelligence and bots. You can have programs running and crawling the internet and just collecting all these instances when Google picks up a local news story, creates content that attracts more people to Google. Why not pay a bit? And it would be very easy to trace, and I think that's the future survival of the newspaper industry hinges on that.
Well, the other thing she mentioned was that the local newspapers, they have to pay domestic taxes, and lots of them, federal taxes and municipal taxes and so on and so forth. And these other organizations, which are profiting from them, don't pay any taxes at all. And the local things also employ people, as she said, who are, they're in the workforce, they're paying taxes, they're contributing to the economy and so on and so forth. And this foreign source comes in, plucks the news information and says, thank you very much, goodbye, we don't have to pay anything. So that's kind of a thing that I think the governments are starting to look at this idea, if nothing else, the idea of taxing. We'll see where that goes.
It's starting in France already with,
Yeah.
They've passed a new law where they're taxing all the big giants, the GAFA, so Google, Facebook, Amazon. But the thing is, they've just passed it a few months ago, and everybody fears a reaction from the States because they're taxing American companies. And so that's also an issue that we should look at. How is it going to happen in France? Because they want to protect copyright for newspapers and publishers. And so this is why the law was passed. It became law now, but it's good to look at this.
And France has one of the strongest copyright laws in the world. Like, I have friends who are journalists who have moved to France because even as freelancers they're protected there. But I definitely think. This is an issue for the American newspaper industry as well. There are how many hundreds of small local American newspapers are closing because they simply cannot get the model that they used to work on doesn't work anymore. Print advertising doesn't bring nearly as much money as it used to because everything is going to digital, and digital is just so much cheaper. Mm-hmm. And so much more targeted.
Well, if you have any thoughts on this, if you're listening and you have some thoughts, drop us a line and share your thoughts with us. We're going to move on now and take a bit of a look back in history in Canada. Well, an exhibition at this year's Bonavista Biennale in St. John's, Newfoundland, highlights the dark part of that province's history and the island's involvement in the 18th century slave trade. And Matthew, this was your story.
Yes, so few people know it, but Newfoundland built several ships in the 18th century to transport mainly slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and America. And a Toronto artist and academic called Camille Turner created an Afronatic research lab, that's how she called it, consisting of futuristic reading room, as she describes it. So the public is invited to come into a room and engage with material which consists of newspapers from the 18th century, or also books that look at the evidence of slavery and its connection to Newfoundland. It's quite you'll see in the article, it's quite dark, a place with a lot of flashing lights and videos. And Turner really focused the exhibition on the 19 slave ships that were built on the island. And she explained to us how she represented them.
I actually created a video of a character who is walking across the landscape, and she's bringing a stone. Now, this stone I'm using as a symbol for the people that would have been loaded onto these slave ships, because these are displacement vessels, so they're meant to carry a load. And in the absence of the load, which is going, they were made to carry people, they would put stones on the boats. And when they would get to the place where the people would be loaded on, the stones would be loaded off. So thinking about repatriating a stone to this place and to use that stone as a symbol for the people that would have been loaded into these ships.
So to create this artistic installation, she used all the information she could find, which wasn't easy at all. But she explained to me that she found a lot of material about these expeditions, the boats, the destination, what was in it. But one thing was missing: information about the victims of trafficking and their lives. We had only even not their names. We had nothing about them. And Turner doesn't want to stop here, and she wants to continue research to know more about this, as she explained.
I mean, this is just scratching the surface. There were 19 slave ships that were built in Newfoundland, but all along the Atlantic coast of Canada, there were many more ships built, in Halifax, Mahoney Bay, Quebec, New Brunswick, St. John. I think there were something like 74 voyages altogether of 42 ships. So the work continues, and that's just the ships. I mean, there's a lot that we just don't even know yet, and it's difficult to find the answers. Doing this research involves, looking in the dark, which is why when you come into the lab, it's a dark room, and there are magnifying glasses and flashlights, because that's what it's like. You're, searching through the dark. This particular database happens to be online, but a lot of people don't know about it. And if you go to, the archives in Canada, you won't be able to find this information. Or even if it's there, it's really not even indexed, so that it's really difficult to find. So you have to know it exists to be able to find it.
So this was Camille Turner, a Toronto artist and academic. And this Canadian history that is not really known has been highlighted, as she explained, by the reaction of the visitors. Most of them were shocked when they went to this exhibition. But this work, is good to know that this work of remembrance is not the only one done in Canada. Right now in Atlantic Canada, many are looking into this, and they would like to understand the role of slave economy played in the region's history, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, so now going back to our top story, we have, of course, the election in Canada, and if you want to find out a little bit more about it, Marie-Claude?
Yes, well, if you want to be well informed and not be submitted to fake news, you can start by going on our website. How about the homepage? We can direct you to several dossiers or other site that will give you plenty of information. If you can look at the right of the screen, so on top we have our own dossier explaining you all this Canadian political system, how it works to be in a election
right
campaign.
there, yeah.
Top
There it
right,
is.
did I say left?
There
Yeah.
it is.
So there's several things you can click on. So of course, the elections were launched Wednesday. We have 4 main parties, right? Can we say them? The Liberal Canadian Party, the New Democratic Party, the Conservative. Yeah. So you can find out more info
Bloc Québécois
about
and the Greens.
And
So-
the newest party,
And the
the
newest
PPC,
party, the
which-
People's Party of Canada.
Yeah. Now, if you want to follow more how those parties are progressing in the popularity of across the population, here we go. That our icon directs you to CBC poll tracker. Now, right now, as of the 12th of September, in polls, the Conservatives have the favor in the popular
Slightly
vote,
ahead.
slightly, but as we were discussing, Mark and I, yesterday, it doesn't mean that they have the most chance of winning because, Mark, explain to us.
Because of our system, which is called the first past the post system, even if your party is more popular than the general population, it doesn't mean that translates to individual ridings where a candidate from one party can win. And therefore, more candidates from that party may win individual ridings. They add up to make a majority type of government, or in other words, winning anyway enough seats in Parliament to form the government. So
It has to do with the geographic distribution of seats. So
Yeah.
where each party's vote is concentrated. So to win, you need to win Ontario, Quebec, the Atlantic Canada, and some votes in the West. And right now, the Liberals are very strong in Ontario, stronger in Quebec, and we'll see in Atlantic Canada. The Conservative vote is mostly concentrated in Western Canada, in the prairies, and suburbs of Greater Toronto. But we'll see whether they get enough inroads in Quebec and in other parts of Canada to unseat the Liberals.
and of course, we're always waiting for that one issue that may change the
and
direction entirely.
You have until the 1st of October to submit your candidacy if you want to be running in the election.
Wow.
So here we go.
I vote for Levant. There you go. Well, that's all the
Can-
time we have for the show for today. So from Marie-Claude and Matt and Levant and myself and the guys who controlled it all, Benoit and Marc-André and Pierre Dutil, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Take care until next
Bye.
week. Bye-bye.